Howdy, folks. Welcome to Redneck Gone Green. I'm your host, David Cobb. I am the redneck. You bet I've gone green, and I'm trying to get you to do it too. And as a reminder, as we always do on this program, when we talk about going green, we ain't talking about mere environmentalism. We talking about deep ecology. We talking about the interconnectedness of all of life. And whether you look at that from a deeply spiritual eco-feminist framework, or you look at it from a hard science perspective, or like me, you say those are both completely valid ways of understanding the world, let me just tell you this. All of life is interconnected in a web, and whatever we do to that web, we are ultimately doing to ourselves. And y'all, let's be honest, we doing it wrong. We're literally destroying Mother Earth faster than she can replenish herself, and we have an ever-closing window to do something about it. And this program is all about bringing you voices of people who are trying to do something about it. And with that, let's bring in one of those people who are trying to do something about it, our good friend and co-host, Shane Knight. Shane, brother, how you doing?
I'm all right, man. A little tired, but we got a lot of irons in the fire.
We sure do. And I got to say, Shane, I am really looking forward to this show. I know redheaded fella that you are, I know a little bit about your background. I too descend from both Irish and Scottish background. So I'm eager to get into it. But before we do, as always, I reckon our good friends over at the Democracy Collaborative have put together a little video montage of the Trump tracker. Am I right?
I do believe we have one.
I haven't even had a chance to watch it yet.
This week's Tracking the Crisis.
Oh, yeah. Well, here we go.
A weekly news roundup of Trump administration actions and movement responses. Charlie Kirk, co-founder of Turning Point USA, a controversial far-right organization focused on college campuses, was shot and killed by 22-year-old Tyler Robinson during a speaking engagement at Utah Valley University on Wednesday, September 10th. Politicians across party lines condemned the shooting as an act of political violence and a worrying escalation after Minnesota lawmaker Melissa Hortman was killed in June. On Wednesday night, before the shooter was captured and identified, Trump called Charlie Kirk a martyr for truth and freedom and declared the radical left to be directly responsible for the killing. A right-wing website exposed personal details of people they accused of mocking Kirk's death. Even though evidence suggests the shooter was part of a rival right-wing organization, teachers and professionals are still being fired over making critical comments about Kirk, including the Washington Post's only full-time Black opinion columnist, Karen Attiah, after she quoted Kirk's own words in her piece. Wired magazine reports that other critics are receiving death threats. This morning, the Trump administration announced a vast crackdown on liberal and left-wing organizations. Meanwhile, on the same day Kirk was shot, a student influenced by right-wing extremist organizations opened fire at Evergreen High School in Colorado, critically injuring 2 fellow students before he turned the gun on himself. And at least 7 HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, went on lockdown Thursday after threats of violence were called in to several campuses. The Congressional Black Caucus called on the FBI to launch a serious investigation into the threats, which they called a chilling reminder of the relentless racism and extremism that continues to target and terrorize Black communities in this country. Communities are resisting ICE raids in a lot of diverse and creative ways. One social media trend that is going viral is inspiring white women to put Mexican flag stickers on their cars as a way to turn ICE's racial profiling against them, drawing attention away from vulnerable neighbors and wasting ICE agents' time. A recent poll released by Associated Press shows that 66% of rank-and-file Democrats have a positive view of socialism, while only 41% have a positive view of capitalism. The shifts underscore deep divisions within the party as they face an unprecedented voter registration crisis about whether supporting Democratic socialists like Zoran Mamdani will hurt the Democrats' political chances or galvanize greater support from people who are concerned about issues like the cost of living. That's it for this week's Tracking the Crisis. Read more by signing up for our weekly news roundup in your email every Friday at trackingthecrisis.org. Back to you, David and Shane.
That was a heavy one, Shane.
Yeah, I'm glad she ended it on a nice note and mentioned the whole thing about the bumper stickers. I can tell you, being in New York City, I've seen a whole lot of them.
You know, the idea of white women with Mexican flags, it kind of chokes me up a little bit, Shane. I mean, like that's like a reverse Karen.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. But
got
it's
a
for a
good
good
friend.
cause.
I got Ruthie and I, folks who know me know my work and life partner, Ruthie. We have a very dear friend, George Friday, who talks about the importance of what she says is the judicious use of privilege, which is both white skin privilege and male skin privilege are unearned, but they do exist. And rather than try to pretend like it's not there, use it for good and use it judiciously. And that's about as good as an example as I could imagine.
Yeah, I'm right there with you.
And I also let's just be clear, y'all. What we're seeing happening now is a ratcheting of political violence. It's going to get worse. There's no doubt about it. We're seeing literally, even as we speak, the right wing is trying to turn Charlie Kirk into Horst Wessel, who is basically a fabricated martyr. He did in fact get shot, but they literally created the Nazi Party created out of whole cloth a heroic backstory that simply was not true. And it's with that in mind, Shane, that I want to bring our guest into the conversation. He's a history professor at St. Mary's University in Belfast. I will say I fancy myself as somebody who's pretty educated and follows stuff. But in 1 hour, this man blew my mind with the both breadth and depth of his knowledge of not just Irish history and not just Irish republicanism, but Irish Republican socialism, putting it into context in a way that I said, I can't wait to bring him on to Redneck Gone Green. With that, let me welcome Dr. Fearghal. Welcome to the conversation.
Well, how is?
Mighty fine. I'm going to ask you one time to slowly pronounce your name, your last name, because I know I would just butcher it.
So it's Fargal or Fearghal Mac Bhloscaigh. So I told you before, think of the corrupt policeman in The Godfather, McCluskey.
McCluskey.
And
But the thing is, if you say it really slow, I hear, oh, it's McCluskey. But y'all, listen here. Let me just say right up front, please listen to the words and don't just get caught up in that beautiful Irish brogue and the lilt of the language. Listen to what this man has to say, because I'm here to tell you, I don't reckon I've ever actually met somebody who can do what we're about to do, and which is to do a deep dive on Irish Republican socialism and lessons for the U.S. left. But before we do this, I want you, Fearghal, to give us a little bit about your own background and how you came to study specifically Irish Republican socialism.
So I'm from a place in the north of Ireland called Tyrone, which is right in the middle. One of the 6 counties. Ireland was partitioned in 1921. And when I was growing up, I was born in 1978, when the Troubles were going on. And Tyrone, the part of Tyrone where I'm from, was a prominent area where the Provisional IRA had a lot of support within the nationalist population. So it was an area under occupation from the perspective of Republican people. It was also an area where the Republican movement was essentially a working class insurrection against the discriminatory unionist regime, which was backed by the British imperial state. Therefore, this sort of merging of a Republican consciousness and a working class consciousness was intrinsic to my environment when I was growing up. Therefore, and the area where I lived was actually the last place to be conquered by the British 400 years previously, and there was a sort of local indigenous tradition of anti-English resistance, anti-colonial resistance. The area was also the scene of the plantation of Ulster, where the most concentrated elements of what was called settler colonialism took place in Ireland. So ironically, the most Gaelic or the most indigenous part of Ireland actually became then the most British part of Ireland after the conquest. And you're dealing really with the legacy of that conquest in the 400 years after. and the Troubles itself, in many respects, was about a movement for Irish self-determination and decolonisation within the context of this colonial history. So you couldn't really not be interested in history growing up where I grew up. And because I was surrounded by a military conflict between a revolutionary Republican organisation, which my own background was quite close to, and the forces of British occupation, obviously it piqued my interest in getting to know something about Irish history. And because I came from a working class Republican background then, I was a socialist from a very early age. My father was a socialist as well, and there's quite a natural affinity, in my opinion, between anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and socialism, and that sparked the interest. I had no other choice. Really.
Yeah, it's in the air you breathe and the water that you drink, right? And we're going to get into that, and I could not agree with you more. The natural, not just affinity, but I would argue you can't actually be a good socialist and not be an anti-imperialist. And bluntly, if you are anti-imperialist and not socialist, then you actually are going to stumble, right? Like, so we're going to get into that. Before we do, I want you to educate our audience a bit on what I came to understand why it is so very important to talk about the 6 counties as the north of Ireland as opposed to Northern Ireland. And so for a U.S. person, that may seem like a distinction without a difference, but it fucking matters, doesn't it?
Yeah, but it was something worth fighting for. So essentially what happens, partition is an imperial policy that Britain practices across the globe. Partition was a way in which the British Empire could subvert a revolution in Ireland. Revolution in Ireland begins in 1916 with during basically the hothouse conditions of the First World War, when revolution is abroad across Europe and globally. And in 1916, 3 tendencies come together, really: the decolonial cultural revival, the socialists, the Irish Republican Socialists, epitomised by James Connolly, and then an older lower orders Republican tradition called Fearghalism come together, and they have a revolution in Easter week 1916, and they issue a proclamation. The proclamation talks about the universal ownership of the property of Ireland by the people of Ireland as a democratic programme which pledges to gender equality, etc., etc. The British don't respond very well to this. They execute the leaders, and this leads to a sea change in Irish popular opinion, which had previously tried in a quite a utilitarian fashion to cut its cloth and integrate itself into the British Empire. By 1918, there's a massive democratic mandate for an Irish Republic, and Britain responds not by implementing the freedom of small nations that they had promised before the First World War, or indeed fulfilling the 14 points of the quite hypocritical 14 points of the US President Woodrow Wilson. Britain responds by force, and it also responds by scuppering or sponsoring or sort of stopping this movement by playing on the existence of this consolidated settler colonial population in the north of Ireland. Now, the British called it Northern Ireland whenever they partitioned the country, even though the most northerly part of Ireland isn't in the 6th. Yeah. And the reason why people who don't agree with partition don't call it Northern Ireland is that, in essence, it's given in verbal recognition. It's given verbal recognition to what was, in essence, an anti-democratic and colonial measure in order to scupper the Irish Revolution. What the British essentially do is they impose a discriminatory sectarian. It's not a state, it's a devolved institution in the north of Ireland. It's a devolved government still under British sovereignty, and they give limited independence to the 26 counties, or to what is now today the Republic of Ireland. It's dominion status, the same sort of constitutional relationship that the white colonies like Canada and Australia had. So they set up a conservative and essentially anti-revolutionary or reactionary government in the south of Ireland, where Catholicism and small capital are dominant, and in the north they set up the sectarian discriminatory state. And the idealism and the universalist credentials of the 1916 Rising and the Irish Revolution are essentially defeated, and the chief mechanism for this is partition. And we're still dealing with the consequences of that in Ireland to the very day.
So you're already diving right in. I do want to pause for a moment, take one step back.
Oh yeah.
And y'all, if you are joining this conversation, here's how I understand it in my simplistic redneck sense, and that goes like this: Ireland is an island, and it's one island, and it is a united Ireland, and so the north of Ireland is those 6 counties, which aren't even the full 9 counties, just to really put a insult to injury. With the British and the UK, which is not united, by the way, but the colonizers call it Northern Ireland as a political statement. So for those of us who are freedom fighters, for those of us who understand self-determination, for those of us who honor the history of Irish socialist republicanism, it is imperative and important that we understand that it is a political statement to call it the North of Ireland. Fargal, that's how I have kind of helped myself to understand in my kind of simplistic way of thinking.
Yeah, there's nothing simplistic about that analysis. In fact, on a very basic level, it's true. I think what you have to understand then is that if you're talking about Ireland as a geopolitical unit, it's a geopolitical unit before British intervention, and the subsequent supposed Irish question that the British governments and statesmen are always talking about is in essence a question of imperial domination and colonisation, and then the mischaracterisation of the conflict in Ireland, this idea that it's between 2 warring tribes and it's a religious issue between Catholics and Protestants. What you have to understand then is that in very many respects, the sectarianism serves a social function in Ireland in the same way that race served a social function for the elite in the United States of America or in South Africa. And the affinities of the settler colonial group, and what are called unionists or loyalists in the north of Ireland, the people who controlled it for the 6 counties for half a century before the Troubles, their affinity is to other settled colonial entities, South Africa, the Ku Klux Klan in the southern states of the United States of America, and more recently, obviously, the settler colonial apartheid state in Israel. So that's their affinities are with.
Yeah.
Africans' affinities are with decolonization and anti-colonial movements, and obviously, because it's the wretched of the earth who engage in insurrection and engage in revolution, typically Irish republicanism has been the political discourse or idiom of the oppressed and the lower classes, and as tends to happen in an awful lot of nationalist movements, people who make a couple of pounds, who get on in life, tend to have more moderate and reasonable attitude to status quo, and they want to integrate into it, and that's what's called constitutional nationalism in Ireland. These people reject revolutionary republicanism, and they try and basically get a place at the master's table.
So it's so deep, and I love it. You're already getting us into the lessons that we can actually learn for modern times. We've got there's been some pretty lively chat. We've got somebody who is a frequent contributor. He goes by "You Don't Like My Music," but he asks a very provocative question. Didn't Free Staters oppose the Republicans?
Yes.
Love to have you unpack that.
So you have to understand that the partition settlement in Ireland emerges from what's called the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Now, partition had been instituted the year before the treaty was signed, and it's actually conservative elements within the revolutionary Republican movement who signed this treaty, and they fight a civil war against the people who adhere to republicanism and want a united, completely independent Ireland and anti-imperial Ireland, really. That this, what's called in Ireland, the shawning class, and shawning comes from the old Irish word for Little John Bull being Britain. This shawning class take Dominion status and power, and they're used as a proxy really to defeat the revolution. And they do it, the most famous incident in this is when, the leader of the Free Staters, who's Michael Collins, who, if anybody watched Neil Jordan's film with Liam Neeson, would think he was a Republican hero. He's not. He's actually a counter-revolutionary. In order to attack the real anti-imperialists and the Republicans in the forecourts in Dublin on the 20th of June 1922 to start the Civil War, he borrows guns from the British. And the British basically compel him to attack the Republicans. In fact, the British had ordered their own army to attack the Republican garrison 2 days previously, but the commander of the army had told them, don't do that, because if we attack the Republicans, the revolution will start again. We need to get our Quisling to attack the Republicans for us. So the Free Staters are the people who carry out extrajudicial murder. They killed 77 Republicans during the Civil War. In fact, they execute far more Republicans than the British did during the War of Independence. So you have to understand this not just in terms of nationality and identity, but understand it in terms of class. Because what is the Free State? The Free State is the bourgeois, Catholic, small property class who were riding into devolved administration and their place at the imperial table before the First World War, when the settler colonial tendency in Ulster kind of scuppered their plans for home rule, and that's what home rule was. It was limited devolved government within the British Empire. And then the First World War begins and there's an explosion of revolutionary activity in Ireland. And in essence, what the Free State is, it's the reassertion of this bourgeois Catholic type of constitutional nationalism. It's the southern part of the counter-revolution. I know we're going to talk about James Connolly later on, so that's why.
No, we're going to get into Connolly right away, because I feel like you've literally, like, your conversation around class and working class and how it affects republicanism. I really feel like we've got to go there right away. And so for folks who maybe have not heard of James Connolly, let me just ask you, why does James Connolly matter for this conversation?
James Connolly matters because what he does is he articulates the revolutionary Fenian tradition that I talked about in Marxist terms. Okay, and he also dispels an awful lot of the nonsense that's written about, Irish republicanism being chauvinistic and sectarianism, etc. Connolly wasn't even born in Ireland. He was born amongst the destitute Irish population in Edinburgh. His parents had come from Monaghan, which was one of those three counties you talked about that wasn't integrated into the north of Ireland. And the reason why the Monaghan, Cavan and Donegal aren't integrated into the north of Ireland is there are too many Catholics in it. And the unionists wouldn't have had complete political domination. Anyway, what Connolly does is he synthesizes Second International Marxism with revolutionary Fenianism. He kind of, the best way to try and describe this is to go back to the Civil War. Connolly predicted the outcome of the Civil War and partition in 1914 when the British strategy was first mooted. He said that partition would lead to a carnival of reaction north and south. And that's what partition does. And what Connolly understood by this is that the worst elements of what he called orange capitalism or pro-British capitalism in the north would control their own population by marginalizing the Catholic population, very much in the same way that, in the southern states of America, the patrician class controlled the white working class and lower class through racism. And there are distinct parallels to this. In the South, what he meant was that this small Catholic property class, in alliance with the Catholic Church, would essentially get rid of any sort of universalist tendency or any sort of radical humanist tradition, and they would ensconce, they would lock in class relations in the South in a similar fashion. And the chief beneficiary of all this obviously would be the Imperium in London, who wouldn't be confronted with a revolutionary republic on their western flank.
One of the things, Connolly said a lot of smart things, but the one that is just etched in my memory: the cause of labor is the cause of Ireland. The cause of Ireland is the cause of labor. They cannot be severed. I mean, that is about as clear and unequivocal understanding of why, at least for Connolly, and I'll say for myself, understanding republicanism and socialism together is where real liberty lies. And I'm curious, Fearghal, am I oversimplifying it, or just invite you to help us think through that relationship?
No, it's not. It's only oversimplified if it's static. If it's viewed in a dialectical fashion, it's not oversimplified at all. It's actually the way. Your
Marxism is showing, comrade.
Yeah, it's the way that you understand Irish history. So you must understand Irish history as a history of colonialism, and colonialism isn't an event, colonialism is a process. So what I could do here is, in as dialectical a fashion as I possibly can, I tell you that don't understand Irish history by Catholic and Protestant, understand Irish history in terms of the collision between sectarianism as an instrument for social control in the colonial context with class. And the best way to try and do this is to identify the three tendencies that we've been talking about. We've talking about a chauvinistic settler colonial tendency. A lot of those people are concentrated in the north of Ireland, and they are anti-humanist. They reject the Enlightenment. There's a lot of them about.
We got them here in this country too.
An awful lot of these people about, yeah. So
that bastards, we call them.
Yeah. Fascists, basically.
Yeah, they're fascists.
Proto-fascists. So that's a chauvinistic tendency. Now, the indigenous population have two other tendencies. One tendency is what I talked about is the radical humanist tendency, which emerges after the French Revolution and involves a synthesis really of demands for Irish liberation with the universalist ideas of the French Revolution. So this idea that Ireland's about Catholics and Protestants, no, Irish republicanism recognises the colonial heritage. In fact, Irish republicanism is established by Irish Protestants, most notably Wolfe Tone. But what they do is, through the use of reason, the true light of reason, they're going to overturn this colonial heritage, and they're going to establish a civic nation based on universal concepts of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Now, republicanism is really important in this context, and they obviously, like Republicans across Europe in the late 1700s, they rely on the sans-culotte, they rely on the man of no property. But there's also a tendency in Ireland called constitutional nationalism, which is essentially an integrationist form and British utilitarianism in an Irish context. And these are the people, who want a seat at the master table. This is this emergent Catholic mercantilist class with their spokesman and usually second oldest son in the Catholic Church who cut a deal with Britain. And that's the story of Ireland. And it's a story based on class relations in the colonial context. And what Connolly does before anybody else does is he uses this Marxist dialectic to try and conceptualize and understand Irish history. But as Marx himself said, the point is not to understand it, the point is to change it. Yeah. And Connolly's big innovation is that he preempts much of what somebody like Antonio Gramsci would do later on, is that he identifies what he calls, Gramsci would call the national popular will as the key to creating hegemony in a country. And he views Irish republicanism as the hegemonic ideology of the Catholic lower orders, of the Irish lower orders. And he says it's through the collision of the inherent Irish republicanism and this derived second international Marxism or syndicalism in his case. Connolly very famously says he believes in constitutional methods in ordinary times and revolutionary methods in revolutionary times. So he's not static in his political thinking. What he is he applies these principles and this synthesis, this dialectical way of understanding Irish history to the circumstances that he's presented with. And this leads him on quite a political journey.
And I love it. And we could spend all the rest of our program really talking about Connolly himself, but let's just acknowledge that Connolly's understanding of sense making, right? Of saying, all right, we're going to help ordinary working class folk understand who they are and to not reject their ethnicity, their reality, but to say, put it into a context that is part of a colonial exploitive dominator system. This is again why Irish Republican socialism is where I think that there are lessons to be learned. I do want to shift gears. Of course, we know that he was executed in 1916 by frankly by the Brits and the colonizers. But I want to invite you to help us understand how Connolly's ideas lived on after his execution in 1916. So
Connolly's big concept, Connolly is the applicant, Connolly applies syndicalism. Syndicalism that he cuts his teeth as a syndicalist in the United States of America, actually, and he returns to Ireland to set up the Irish version of the One Big Union, okay, which is the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. He engages in massive militancy in 1913 during what's called the Dublin Lockout, which is a massive confrontation, not with unionist employers or British employers, but Irish nationalist Catholic employers backed by the Catholic Church. Now, Connolly's conception is that the country that he wants to create is a workers' republic, or what he calls a cooperative commonwealth. Now, Connolly dies for these principles, and actually what happens in Ireland between 1917 and the end of, and the creation of the Free State, the big clampdown, is there's an explosion of labour militancy in Ireland based on these syndicalist principles. There are 80 Soviets founded in the south of Ireland between 1920 and 1922, and this is a history that the people who ran the Free State didn't want. It wasn't on too many history syllabuses, but my own research indicates that there was a massive upsurge of trade union militancy and syndicalism in Ireland, which was a direct consequence of Connolly. And the way that this was defeated is really important, because one of the hubs of this is in actually East Ulster, where the north of Ireland, where a group of Connollyite Protestant socialists from Belfast used two unions. They used the Workers' Union and they used the Flax Rougher's Union, which basically deals with the linen industry in the north of Ireland. Okay, a lot of the industrialisation in the north of Ireland was based on production of linen, and Belfast becomes known as the Linenopolis. Now, these people are dealing with the most unskilled and the poorest workers in the north of Ireland. They're dealing with women, and they mobilise 50,000 of them. They win 12 seats on Belfast City Council, and they are Connollyite socialists. And one of the big ironies of this is that during the 1920 local government elections in Belfast, there is one Connollyite socialist on the Falls Road, and if anybody knows about Belfast, that's the Republican bit, and there are two Connollyite socialists on the Shank, which is now notorious as this royalist and reactionary area where they're attacking migrants at the minute. But mostly women who worked in mills elected. These people are called Dawson, Gordon and Sam Kay. Now, the manner in which this movement was destroyed was that the Ulster Unionist leadership, the mill owners, the shipyard owners, the big politicians, people like Edward Clarkson, in particular his local fixer, a man called Dawson Bates, these people engineered the expulsion of all Catholic and socialist Protestants from the major industrial centres in Belfast in July 1920. 10,000 workers are expelled from the first of all, the shipyards, very famous shipyards, Horn and Wolf. Anyone who's been to Belfast, they kind of sell Horn and Wolf from the Titanic as, for Belfast is a strange place. The biggest tourist attraction in the city, official tourist attraction, is an unsinkable ship that sank on its first voyage. And it tells you a lot about that sort of that dichotomy within settler colonialism, where they're winners and victims at the same time, always, But that's Connolly's immediate legacy. Connolly's immediate legacy is in this hidden social revolution, which is crushed all in the north, and then is crushed in the Free State. And the best way to try and articulate it is to give you one example. I said that it was conservative and reactionary elements within the Republican movement, within the Sinn Féin movement. These are epitomised by a man called Kevin O'Higgins. Kevin O'Higgins is the son of he's actually related. He's related to a leading politician who was linked to the employers in the Dublin Lockout. During 1919, Dáil Éireann, which is the name of the Irish Parliament, which disassociates itself from Westminster and sets up an alternative subaltern administration, they issue a document called the Democratic Programme, which is essentially a socialist document. And Kevin O'Higgins latterly called, he says, the Democratic Programme was mostly poetry. It was all pen, okay? And he sets up the Party of Order, and he crushes working class militancy. And like a lot of other right-wing reactionaries, he says that the demands of these people is a psychological disorder. these poor people, and his public school boy employs Patrick McGilligan, his colleague, who's also in the cabinet. It's very strange the way that this democratic and egalitarian revolution leads to the creation of a government filled with very wealthy public school boys. You'd almost think the British designed it that way. But
yeah, somebody should look into that. Somebody should look into that.
Patrick McGilligan says that people are going to have to starve in this country before they realise that it's not the government's job to feed them. So,
Yeah.
so
my white trash redneck hackles just get come up in a heartbeat. So look at here. I'm going to put your popular educator skills to the test. I'm going to ask you in a short way, because we're going to get in. The next thing I really want us to talk about a little bit is some lessons learned from Seamus Costello, right? But before we do that, set the stage a little bit to understand the Troubles, like that context. Set the stage a little bit, because I want you to tell us about Seamus Costello and where he took the movement next.
Yeah, so the best way to explain it to you is just Jim Crow, right? On a less terrible scale and involving a smaller population. So the north, the north of Ireland is called the Orange State, and Orangeism is Orange Order is a sectarian organisation. This artificial state is carved out. It's a one-party state for 50 years, the Ulster Unionist Party, and it's created in order to serve wider imperial interests, and it's administered through massive coercive legislation and institutionalised discrimination. Now, the massive coercive legislation, I'll give you a quick statistic. So there's, when partition is enacted, there's one policeman for every 650 people in Wales. There's one policeman for every 700 people in Scotland. There's one policeman for every 140 people in the north of Ireland, and the police are wholly Protestant and directed against 1/3 of the population. So they deploy emergency legislation called the Special Powers Act. And if you want to understand how coercive the Special Powers Act is, Balthazar Foster, who was the Prime Minister of South Africa, said he would give up every piece of coercive legislation by the apartheid government for one clause of the Northern Ireland Special Powers Act. So that's the coercive end of it. In terms of public and private employment, then there's systemic discrimination. And people in the United States of America will understand the way that this worked in America in terms of race. It works in America in a very parallel fashion in terms of religion, okay? And that is why you get this strange sort of idea that in the 1960s, whenever Catholics in the north of Ireland challenged this discrimination, they followed the example of the Black Civil Rights movements in the United States of America. And when one of the most famous one of them, Bernadette Devlin, goes over to the United States to raise funds at the beginning of the Troubles, she has more affinity with the Black Panthers than she does with the cruddy Democratic Irish American politicians.
In fact, you should tell the story of the key to the city that somebody thought it would be a good idea to get Bernadette.
The grantor of the key of the city, and she says, "It ain't my city. I'm going to give it to the people who need it," and she'll give it to the local chapter of the Black Panthers, and that's why a unionist politician called her Castro in a manuscript.
Yep.
Bernadette Devlin Bhloscaigh is a founding member of the IRSP with Seamus Costello. Now, I'm going to have to go in and plug my phone in because.
All right, you do that, and while our professor is on the move getting his thing plugged in, I'll say I got a chance to meet Bernadette Devlin Bhloscaigh, and I have never met a more powerful human being in my life. She vibrates at a different kind of frequency. There is a level of strength and conviction, but also warmth and openness, and a woman after my own heart. After the massacre that the perpetrated by, again, the British colonial occupying forces, some nitwit in Parliament, where she was a member of Parliament, made a comment next to her about how they deserved it. And what did she do, Shane Knight? I'll tell you what she did. She punched him in the fucking mouth is what she did.
He was Reginald Malding. He was the British Home Secretary. and he said that the paratroopers, and actually one of them appeared in court today, he's been charged with the murder of 2 people on Bloody Sunday, although 13 and then eventually 14 people were killed by the parachute regiment. Reginald Malding says that the troops were fired on first, and Bernadette Davlin ran across the floor of the house and hit him, and she actually tried to hit him with the mace, which is a big, massive metal ceremonial club, but it was too heavy for her. So,
yeah, I mean, I'm telling you, like, I need more Bernadette Devlin McCloskey in my life. I'll tell you that right now. So look at here, you're back with us, Fearghal, and I do want to, like, you've set us up a bit, but I do want to ask you very bluntly, like, what role did the Irish Republican Socialist Party play during that time, and especially Seamus Costello in his attempt and others' attempt to carry forward James Connolly's vision?
So the IRSP and the INLA, the Irish National Liberation Army, which was their military wing, actually grew out of a split with what was called the official IRA. So we're going to kill you with acronyms here. In 1969, the civil rights movement, non-violent, following the example of the Black Civil Rights Movement in the United States of America, the movement is non-violent, but the protests aren't, because all the violence comes from the state and from these loyalist or settler colonial tendencies. The most famous one would be Ian Paisley, who I'm sure anybody who's au fait with the Troubles will have heard of. So they're beaten off the streets, and then, as had happened already in Belfast, and I mentioned in 1920, and as happened again in the 1930s, the Unionist elite used the police and right-wing reactionary violence from mobs to terrorise the Catholic population. And they do this in August 1969. Bernadette Davlin is in Derry, where Bloody Sunday will happen, and the police attempt to break into the Bhloscaigh, which is the nationalist part of Derry, with loyalist mobs, and the local population basically have a pitch battle. And it's very famous, called the Battle of the Bhloscaigh. In fact, Bernadette Davlin was the only person arrested for it. She was put in jail. It wasn't because she was guilty of anything, it was to get her out of the way, because she was so politically effective, right? Now, while this is happening, pogromist mobs and police then essentially attempt to ethnically cleanse areas of Belfast over 2 nights on the 14th and the 15th of August. They kill a young man, Patrick Rooney, they kill several residents, they burn large areas of Belfast to the ground in what is essentially pogromist violence. And it's out of this then that there's a split in the IRA, because the IRA up until this period had abandoned what they called armed struggle, and then faced with violence by the state, there's oppressed people never choose their means, right? They always have them chosen for them.
Thrust upon us. Thrust upon us.
Yeah, thrust upon them. So the IRA was actually engaged in the civil rights movement, and it abandoned militarism altogether. And August 1969 then leads to a split in the IRA between what would become the provisional IRA, which would be the main militant element, the main Republican force or insurrectionary force in the Troubles, and then the old rump that's left, the official IRA. Now they're pursuing a Marxist politics, but their Marxism is influenced by Louis Althusser, and as you know, he was a bit nuts, and they kind of do a full revolution, and they essentially become unionist in their orientation. Now, Seamus Costello was a member of the official IRA. He says, look, you're partitionist in your politics, you're abandoning the people in the north of Ireland, you aren't real socialists, you aren't real Marxists, you aren't real revolutionaries, I'm going to go on my own. And he sets up the Irish Republican Socialist Party. And again, this is an attempt at the rearticulation of Connolly's legacy within the context then of a military campaign in the north. Now, he falls out with Bernadette Davlin over that.
Oh.
Bernadette Davlin says that this movement needs to be openly democratic and accountable to its members, and that the military organisation needs to be subordinate to the political organisation. And Costello kind of had a different attitude, and he obviously met a terrible fate because of it. He's killed in a feud with the official IRA. But Costello's big message is the Connolly message. It's the synthesis of class and nationality that real nationality is always international in its orientation. That nationalism on its own is mere chauvinism, and chauvinism will always oppress the supporters of nationalism. The leader will take power, as Frans Fanon says, and he'll tell the masses to go back to their cave. And so this betrayal, and this is so current at the minute, this populist authoritarianism and nativist tendency that is dominating, and very well funded by billionaires for some strange reason, that is dominating a lot of European and US politics, is a false ideology. It's a modern reincarnation of the same type of aggressively chauvinistic populism that led to the expulsions in Belfast, that leads to the rise of fascism in Italy. It says, drain the swamp, there's a massive corruption, we are in favour of the real people, the Volksgemeinschaft, right? But in reality, what it will do is it will shaft these people at the interests. When it comes to the fork in the road where they have to choose between, the good, the yeoman of his acre, it was the backbone of the nation, or the industrialists, the yeoman of his own acre is going out of business. And
so, Fargal, let me tell you something, my friend. You are being pressed into service. One of our commenters, I want to throw that up on the lower third here, says, I want to lead a united Ireland with this guy.
The point would be that no guy will be leading the United.
Yeah.
We need to get away from the guys leading things. And I think I would have agreed with Bernadette Devlin's. I thought there was no alternative but armed struggle in the early 1970s. When my parents' generation, were beaten off the streets in the civil rights, and we're basically, the second generation that was suffering pogromist violence. And under those contexts, you have to fight like hell in order to survive, because you're going to be obliterated again. Right? So there was no choice. And the main arms they were fighting was not, this settler colonial local population. This settler colonial local population had, the backing of a NATO member behind them.
So look at here. So clearly the Irish movement's linking national liberation with class struggle, they got that right. And we've got to really understand that, not only in the US, but across the globe, that notion of connecting those. But equally, the sectarian nature, the tendency that to split and fight with each other rather than the enemy, obviously weakened the Irish left. So what I'm going to ask you is, were there moments when Irish activists were able to bridge those divides and build real, meaningful solidarity, not only across class and community, but even religious lines? Are there any lessons there that we can look to and say, let's replicate that?
Yeah, the Irish history is replete with lessons like that. So I've already outlined what was called the Belfast Labour Party and the Workers' Union and the Flex Roughers in Belfast in 1920. I'm not talking about that. But republicanism itself is, the cradle of republicanism is the late 1700s in Belfast, led by Irish Protestants. So you have several instances in Irish history where there have been mass movements of people pledged to a radical humanist message from the 1790s and the 1920s. Now, so this is, and again, you asked me earlier on about the cause of labour as a cause of Ireland. Is this a good summation? I say it's only a good summation if it's approached dialectically. And this is one of the big problems with a lot of politics, is that they take static, dichotomized criteria for human beings, and they say, you believe that you belong in this box, and you belong in this box. You have the mark of Cain. You're never going to be any good, right? And that's what they've done in Ireland. They've basically created, in order to solve their own sectarian conflict, they've created institutionalized sectarianism.
Right.
Through the Good Friday Agreement, because they go, Catholics and Protestants can never get on together, and they're always going to be immutably opposed to each other, and therefore we have to create this grand structure of power sharing where there's absolute dysfunction. You were in Belfast, the rising child poverty, the dealing with the consequences of a decade and a half of austerity. Everything's falling apart. But it's okay, it's okay because it allows, George Mitchell and Bill Clinton, I'm not going to say about other places they went to, but it allows them to come to Belfast and celebrate themselves as great peacemakers. Tony Blair, that great peacemaker, came to Belfast. So there's the very interesting thing is that the peace process is based on a thing called the Mitchell Principles, named after George Mitchell, and you have to renounce political violence and engage solely in what's called constitutional politics. And I always think the Mitchell Principles are beautiful. I just always regret the fact that they're never applied outside Ireland. That actually Ireland's like this hermetically saint. The people who preach them, so they got Hillary Clinton and George Mitchell and Tony Blair, preach them in Ireland and then just spread carnage.
Oh, absolutely. And always, like, let's of course talk about the genocide going on even as we speak, right? In Palestine, not just Gaza, but across the entire nation of Palestine. And it is in fact a nation. We're running out of time, so I do want to make sure to touch on something. And so when you look at the U.S. left today, labor, racial justice, climate fights, what parallels do you see with the Irish struggles when you look at the U.S. and what lessons would you say the U.S. left can learn from Irish Republican socialism?
To identify the rational kernel within the irrational politics, right? So the mystification of politics in the United States of America and in Ireland previously, this idea about, types of people, these locked-in types of people, right? When Irish history actually demonstrates that you have to get down to the base level of class, and it has to be an understanding. And the United Irishmen did this. They says, "Are we forever to walk on fields that our ancestors drenched in blood? We have thought too much of the path of posterity, not enough of the future." So you have to present people with a genuine alternative based on an understanding, a proper understanding of the dynamics of their society. And any understanding of the malaise within the United States, of austerity in Britain and across Europe, any genuine understanding of this has to be projected through the prism of class. Because the reasons why all of these things are happening is because of unleashed markets, of 2 generations of neoliberalism, and of the fact that, as I was going to quote Jarvis Cocker's favourite, one of his favourite songs about the type of person who still rules the world, but it's highly inappropriate for YouTube and you'd get demonetized. So the whole thing about this is that until that baseline understanding of the way that society operates, right? And people have that already. In fact, populists and demagogues and the far right play on this all the time.
Oh, and they know it, right?
Yeah.
And then they tell us a lie. That's what really gets it just chaps my ass, Shane. Like,
well, people buy into it too. That's what blows my mind. It's like they know that there is a controlling class, but yet the unifying concept of getting behind that idea, that's what we try to do all the time. And it's like people just refuse it, or they hear it goes in one ear and right out the other.
But again, and I keep overusing the word dialectical, but it is a dialectic because there's a symbiotic relationship between this populist right and this bureaucratic liberal centre. They're both owned. They're both owned by big capital, and they both serve the same function. It's a symbiotic relationship. And it's the same in France with Macron and Le Pen. It's the same in Britain with Farage and Starmer. It's the same with the establishment Democrats and Trump. It's this idea that these are the polarized limits. These are the 2 things that you have to choose, and they're both shit. And they're not going to solve the problems in your life. The only things that will solve the problem in your life is popular mobilization. The only reason why there was any historical change in Ireland was that the lower orders in Ireland demanded it. There was insurrections in 1798. There was a social revolution in Ireland from 1879 to 1884 called the Land War, but they basically destroyed the aristocracy in Ireland, got rid of the landlord class. Now, the British came in and instead of nationalising the land, as Michael Davitt, the leader of the land he wanted, they created peasant proprietorship, so the yeoman of his acre was back again.
They buy us off, don't they?
Oh
like
yeah.
with just crumbs. Like that's the bastards. Like they there is a history of this.
But
It's
again,
like two competing forces playing ping pong, and we're the fucking ball on the table.
yeah, we need to change the game, don't we? That's
Yeah.
It is.
needs to be a game changer. But this will go back to the Costello-Devlin dispute, because Irish republicanism is based on a vanguardist principle. So it's since the Fenians, the Fenians are founded in the United States of America, in New York, by John O'Mahony, and there's a dual organisation. You know, there's the Irish Americans after the famine who want revenge, and then there's the home organisation of poor people who want a republic. But it's based on, you know, Blanquet's French cell structure. It's about a vanguard coming, having a political revolution, and then creating democracy. What Connolly always argued is, no, you can't do that. He was more like Rosa Luxemburg. You have to actually create democracy on the shop floor. You have to create democracy through democratic organisation. And it's through that then that you create the new state in embryo. It's only through mass, open, democratic organisation that you lay the proper seedbed for a successful revolution. Now, he changed his mind in 1916, but he changed his mind in 1916 because he looked at the battlefields of Europe being drenched in the blood of working class people. And he was the second international Marxist who basically believed that once war was declared, there'd be barricades all over Europe and the working class would overthrow capitalism. It didn't happen. And that's where chauvinism come in again. So I would say that the big thing is about democratic mobilisation and to organise, for ordinary people to become politically conscious, to understand the root cause of the problems in their life, and to cooperate and come together democratically in order to find solutions. And if enough, you know, what did Howard say? If you know, millions of people, ordinary people doing the right thing, then you get positive historical change.
Well, listen, I mean, I thought you did a beautiful job. I was good, and I know it's 3 minutes to midnight in Ireland, so we really appreciate you staying up late and having this conversation with us, Fargal. So you've already summed up the Irish Republican socialism and what we as U.S. in the U.S. can learn from it. But I'm going to invite you, if there are any final thoughts, whether they're Connolly quotes or Bernadette quotes, or just any final thoughts you have in these last waning minutes. I want to give you that opportunity.
It's that there's always hope, and as an historian, we always think that the present moment is incredibly dangerous, and you have the rise of authoritarianism across Europe and the West at the minute. But I actually grew up in an environment where, and Marx says that the bourgeois mask slips in the colonies, and you know, you actually see what it's about. Well, I lived in a colony where there was no habeas corpus or free speech, or where basically you could be lifted and thrown into prison anytime you wanted to. Okay, so this happens throughout human history, but throughout human history, when this happens, it's not always a case of the oppressor continues to dominate. People do mobilise and fight back. And the first step to mobilising and fighting back is to become conscious of what is going on and what agency you have, not just as a person, as you said earlier on about, I'm going to lead on with this guy. You guys and gals and anybody else come together democratically on a mass basis towards a human future, then great things can happen in society and history. The key step to that is that people have to think that it can succeed. They
exactly. Have to. You know, and this is the thing that my trip throughout Ireland, across Scotland, the ordinary folks have a sense of we can do this, like that there is a kind of optimism in Ireland that like, you know, it's just a rugged, fierce, like determination that was like mother's milk to me. I just got to tell you, Fargal, like I am looking forward to getting back and being with y'all again. I want to thank you so much for this fantastic conversation. And I'll let y'all know This is a plan that we've got set up. What we've done is a historic context for lessons that we can learn from Irish Republican socialism. Next week, we're going to do a deep dive on a very concrete example of that. A group in Belfast called Glór na Mona. I met those folks while I was there, and I've gotten to know them very well. We at the People's Network for Land and Liberation are collaborating with them in multiple different ways. I can't wait for y'all to get to know them. We're going to do a deep dive with some of the elders there. And then the following week, I like to call them the next generation. You're going to meet some young folks who are in their 20s who are clearly understanding their role as the next inheritors of this movement. And as the Who used to say, the kids are all right. Really looking forward to it. I want to thank you again, Fargal, for joining the conversation. I want to thank you, the viewer, listener of Redneck Gone Green. Remember that this is getting larger, stronger, and better organized every day, and it's because you like. It's because you comment. It's because you share. It's because you engage. I know everybody says that, and the reason they do is because these tech overlords are trying to suppress us, and yet this audience is growing thanks to you. Shane, I want to thank you again for all you're doing, brother. I know it's dinner time there on the East Coast, so y'all will be back. Remember, can't stop, won't stop. Peace.